The story of Hinterkaifeck is not merely a tale of a century-old unsolved crime. It is a slow descent into a psychological nightmare that blurs the lines between reality and the haunting, located in the deep, rolling farmlands of Bavaria. Germany. The Hinterkaifeck farm was a place of extreme isolation, a small fortress of wood and stone surrounded by the encroaching shadows of the thick, dark forest. In the early 1920s, life here was quiet, labor-intensive, and private. But in the spring of 1922, that privacy was invaded by something nameless, something that watched from the dark corners of the property for weeks before acting. It is a case that has defied the best investigative minds for over 100 years, leaving behind a trail of mystery and a chilling question: who was the phantom in the attic? To understand the tragedy, one must first understand the family and the atmosphere of the farm. The Grubers were not well-liked in the local village of Kaifeck. Andreas Gruber, the patriarch, was known as a cold, solitary, and often aggressive man who kept his family in a state of virtual domestic imprisonment. He lived with his wife Ilya, their widowed daughter Victoria, and Victoria as to children 7-year-old Ilya and 2-year-old Joseph. The isolation was not just geographic, it was social and emotional, working the land under the weight of a heavy, uncomfortable silence. But that silence was broken in late March when Andreas began to report strange occurrences to his neighbors, reports that would later serve as the terrifying prologue to a massacre. It began with the smell. In late March, a heavy blanket of white covered the Bavarian countryside. Andreas found a single set of footprints leading from the edge of the forest directly to the farmhouse. In the fresh, undisturbed powder, these tracks stood out with terrifying clarity. He followed them, expecting to find a lost traveler or a neighbor, but the footprints only went one way. They led to the house, but no tracks ever led back out to the woods. The intruder had arrived, and by all accounts, they were still there, hidden somewhere within the walls of the farm. In the days that followed, the atmosphere inside the house became suffocating. Andreas began to hear noises that he could not explain. They were heavy, deliberate footsteps in the attic, a rhythmic pacing that occurred while the rest of the family was supposed to be asleep in their beds. He searched the house from top to bottom, lantern in hand, checking the bar, the tool sheds, and the dark cropses, but he found nothing. Then, house keys that had been in the family for generations suddenly vanished. Someone had tampered with the locks on the doors. Most bizarrely, a newspaper was found on the porch, a regional paper from a city miles away, that no one in the family had purchased or even recognized. The family was being toyed with, hunted in their own home by an entity that refused to show its face. The fear was so palpable that their previous mate had already fled the farm months earlier, terrified and claiming the house was haunted. She told the villagers that she constantly felt a malevolent presence watching her from the shadows. Her replacement, Maria Baumgartner, arrived on the afternoon of March 31st, 1922. She walked into the house to begin her new life, unaware that she had stepped into a death trap. She had less than 12 hours to live. The night of the tragedy was cold and moonless. We can only reconstruct the events based on the positioning of the victims found days later. It is believed that the perpetrator, who had likely been living in the attic for days, listening to their conversations and learning their daily habits, finally decided to strike. One by one, the family members were lured out to the barn. Perhaps they heard a strange noise from the cattle, or perhaps a voice was mimicked in the dark. First Andreas, then the elder Ilya, then Victoria, and finally the young 7-year-old Ilya. As each stepped into the pitch-black darkness of the stable, they were met with a heavy industrial talamana. The violence was swift and overwhelming. After the 4 adults and the young girl were gone, the perpetrator moved toward the main house. There was no rush, no panic. The intruder was in complete control of the farm. They entered the nursery where the -year-old Joseph was sleeping in his cot. Without hesitation, the intruder ended the child's life. The final victim was Maria, the new maid, who was found in her bedchamber before she could even finish unpacking her belongings. 6 lives were extinguished in a single night of absolute brutality. What followed is what truly separates Hinterkaifeck from any ordinary crime. Most flee the scene to avoid capture, but the phantom of Hinterkaifeck stayed. For the next 4 days, The intruder took over the roles of the people they had just replaced. Neighbors saw smoke rising steadily from the chimney every morning and evening. The cows were milked, and the farm dog was cared for. The intruder prepared meals in the kitchen using the family's own supplies. They slept in the beds, perhaps even the very bed where Maria Baumgartner's body lay nearby. The murderer lived a quiet, domestic life in the heart of a graveyard. They moved through the house with the victims cooling in the barn in the bedrooms, completely unbothered by the weight of their horrific actions. By the time the scene was finally discovered on April 4th, the house was still warm, suggesting the intruder had only left hours before. The police investigation that followed was a chaotic disaster. Because the scene had been left for days, forensic evidence was compromised. Thousands of suspects were interviewed over the years. The theories were endless and often contradictory. Some believed it was a robbery, yet large sums of money were often touched. Others believed it was a crime of deep, personal passion. In 2007, a group of students at a German police academy used modern criminal profiling to examine the evidence. While they claimed to have finally identified a primary suspect, they refused to release the name to the public out of respect for the surviving descendants. The farm itself was torn down a year after the events, as no one could bear to live in a place of such profound darkness. Today, the legend persists because it touches on a primal human fear, the fear of the unknown intruder. The phantom of Hinterkaifeck was never caught, leaving us only with the cold, hard facts of a winter night in 1922 when an entire family was erased by a shadow that refused to leave.
The chilling true story of Hinterkaifeck.
A phantom in the attic, watching, waiting.